up on a hill in Vietnam, and it was just this uncomfortable, it was just not, I think I upset my dad more by calling him, and then I think he started to cry and then walked out of the house, because remember, he's stoic. So I talked to Mom, and Mom says, "How are you?" And I said, "I'm fine, don't worry about anything, Mom, I'm fine. I'll be okay." And that was about it for that conversation. But my mother told me years later that the whole year I was in Vietnam, my dad was depressed. And he would come up from the barn at 6 o'clock to watch the 6 o'clock news, thinking he was gonna see me on the 6 o'clock news somehow. And then he'd go back down to the barn and binge milking the cows. So years later, I didn't realize what I had done to my parents, my serving, and how that affects family. And of course, today we know how families, we've never given enough recognition in this country to how the families suffer when they send their loved ones off to war. We've never really, the government, our communities have never really done healing work like we are today through vet centers and including families and bereavement counseling for children. And so that's, we'll get into lessons learned later, but I never realized how much grief, how much my service in Vietnam had affected my parents.
As you're coming back to the United States after your rotation, are you feeling any differently about your sense of patriotism or trust in the government? I guess it wasn't all that high to begin with when you went over. Sense of winnability, talked about body count being the measuring stick of success over there. What were those feelings as you were getting ready to get on an airplane and come back to the United States?
I was so busy in that unit that I was working that I had no feelings about it at all. In fact, I knew what my DROS date was. And I was head nurse in the surgical unit, which was constantly full, because we were getting mass casualties. It was a 45-bed unit, and we were getting patients in and sending patients out, evacuating them on the air evac chain. And it was such a busy time, I didn't have time to really think about the fact that while I'm going to DROS, I actually thought about staying another year, but I wasn't feeling well. I was really tired, and I didn't think, well, being tired was normal. I mean, you work 12, 14-hour shifts every day of the week, and it's constant, and you have a lot of adrenaline. I wasn't on drugs in Vietnam, but I was definitely my own adrenaline junkie, because that adrenaline is pumping. It's really high, and it's a hormone. But I was exhausted, and I thought, I better go home and take a break, and then I'll come back. So then the day I'm to leave, I had thrown everything I owned, which wasn't a lot, into a duffel bag. And I put my boots in there, and I didn't know that there was still blood on my boots. And I didn't know that there were holes in the bottom of my soles, because I never polished my boots. The Mamasans polished our boots. Every morning the polished black boots are sitting in front of my door, and I put on my boots. It wasn't until years later when I opened my foot locker and pulled out, still had red dust from Pleiku on my uniforms. My boots still had blood on them and holes in the soles. And I threw all this together, and I got to Cameron Bay, and then I got to Japan, and I was so exhausted, I just told somebody, one of the COs, that I needed to rest before I took the next plane out. So they found me a place to stay, and I was there for a week, and I wondered if I had malaria, because I just slept for a week, and I thought, oh, I'm just tired. So then I got to Travis Air Force Base, and I did a physical, and I found a spot on my lung. And so it's nothing to worry about, just, sometime just get another x-ray when you get back. Well, I found out later, I came home with tuberculosis. Both of my lungs and my spleen are full of TB. And when I put in a claim to the VA, they denied it. And yet we took care of TB patients all the time, because remember, we're taking care of the indigenous people. But then when I got back to the farm, I realized I wasn't strong enough to go back to Vietnam. So I got a job in a civilian hospital, hated it, quit after 3 weeks. and went to Madigan Army Hospital to work because my hooch mate was going there, so I'd be taking care of
Were you
patients
still
again.
active duty?
No, I was discharged. So now I'm working in the civilian world. I feel out of, it's 1969. The animosity towards veterans is terrible. And I wanted to further my nursing degree, so I applied to the University of Minnesota, signed up for classes, started the first week. Campus was a hotbed of anti-veteran soldiers. It wasn't just anti-war, this was anti-soldier. And I didn't look like a Vietnam veteran, so I escaped. Nobody could say anything to me because I wore regular clothes. But I saw what they were doing to the other guys, and I just seen how they had suffered and how they had died in Vietnam, and this is how they were being treated. I couldn't handle it. I left after a week. And my hooch mate had said she was going to Madigan Army Hospital, so we were roommates there, and I worked for several months there as a civilian in the military hospital. But that's when I decided that I wanted to go back into the military and use my nursing skills where they were validated and take care of the soldiers again. And I really think psychologically that's what saved me, because I think I came back from Vietnam not knowing I was in shock, not knowing I had PTSD, because that's what we know about now. But that I needed to go back in the military because the military base was safe. And I'd be taking care of soldiers again. And instead of just being a pencil pusher in a civilian hospital, the civilian hospital where I worked for 3 weeks, the nurses didn't do anything. They didn't put down NG tubes, they didn't start IVs, they didn't suck out trachs, they had externs and other people. They had respiratory therapists, and they had an IV team. And in Vietnam, we were doing it all. And
I wanted to ask you, Bill and I were talking about this earlier, that do you feel like the nurses that came back from Vietnam influenced the nursing profession in the United States to give more women, more of those
absolutely,
opportunities?
Are we getting short on time too? So,
It's
okay. Yes. Oh, absolutely. The advancement of nursing, the advancement of military nursing in particular, the advancement of medics and corpsmen. When medics and corpsmen from Vietnam, whether they were Navy, Air Force, or Army, came back with all these skills, but no one would acknowledge them because they were military trained. They couldn't be LPNs. And because then they had to go through LPN training. So they started the physician's assistance program. So the whole PA program started with Army
Oh, really?
medics.
When you saw the anti-war and anti-military sentiment at the University of Minnesota, did that change your mind at all about, how were your feelings changing about the war and about the anti-war movement and about the government? The same sorts of questions I was asking about from the perspective of before and during. How are you feeling now that you've come back and you've been in that period after you've been discharged or separated from active duty?
I wasn't feeling a lot because I'd shut down so much and I wanted to forget it. And now that I've gone through therapy for PTSD, I understand how, when my therapist said, your mind, you compartmentalize and you disassociate. And to survive, you have to disassociate that horror to go on and readjust into civilian life. And some of us do it better than others. I think nurses are very good at it because we're caretakers. We were professionals. We were doing our job. And for those of us who didn't self-medicate with drugs and alcohol, we didn't have that problem. But I know some nurses, and of course a lot of our soldiers, had to deal now with that part of recovery. I think mine was I just shut down. The harder I worked, the better I felt. My adrenaline was still pumping. I just had to be busy. The busier I was, the better off I was. And I know that I was having some feelings because I walked into a patient's room at Madigan Army Hospital, and she was the wife of an officer. And she was watching the 6 o'clock news, and she was crying. And she didn't know I had just come back from Vietnam, but she was crying. She was seeing a village that had just been napalmed, and it was showing on TV, the children running out of the village, burning, and the mothers crying and weeping, and, because we saw all of that. And she was crying, and she said, "Isn't that terrible?" And I looked at the TV, and I felt nothing. I didn't burst into tears. I didn't cry. I just I was a cold shell of a person. I felt absolutely nothing. And I had just seen it. I'd come back from it. And I looked at that years later, and I thought, that's how I was surviving. That's how I was able to go to work every day and continue to work. But my mother wanted to take me to see the new movie out called MASH. It was a feature film, before it was television. And I knew I didn't want to go, but Mother thought maybe this would be good for us. I walked out of it after about 10 minutes. I just couldn't handle it. So I was feeling something. I could not put myself through watching that film. And Mother walked out with me, but I wasn't talking to my parents. I wasn't talking to my friends. And after Mike and I got married, I said, don't ask me any questions. Don't ask. He didn't dare ask. I did not talk to my husband about Vietnam. I didn't want to talk about it. And it's because I couldn't talk about it. I had shut down that much.
How your dad?
I remember Dad was watching China Beach. And Mother said he watched China Beach he was addicted to China Beach. And so I was home visiting him once, and China Beach was on, and he said to me, "Diane, you look just like the nurse in China Beach." And I looked over there, and I hadn't watched it, and I was like, oh geez, it was like looking at myself in Vietnam, and I walked out of the door. I just couldn't handle it, so I didn't watch China Beach until they called me and asked me if I would do an interview for China Beach, because China Beach was getting some bad reviews, because they had 20-year-olds writing the script. So they decided to invite the real nurses in and then use their stories. So I reluctantly agreed, because a lot of my fellow nurses were encouraging me to do this. And the reason was, how are they going to be able to portray the real stories of nurses in Vietnam if we don't talk to them? So several of us nurses went out. They actually then, on China Beach, they actually used the interview on the program. So then their reviews went up, and all these Vietnam vets who had nurses in Vietnam said, "Forget about the actresses, we just want to see the real nurses." And they did share the story on China Beach about my father. So Dana Delaney is, one of the scripts. It's like when she left, her father said, "I have 4 sons, but I sent my daughter off to war." So they used some of our stories.
Tell us about your involvement with the Vietnam Women's Project. How that came to what did that happen?
Well, again, there were all these stepping stones, and I think my political conscience was galvanized in Vietnam. What our government did to my generation, and then our government betrays us by scorning us. Our government never stood up for us. No president, no general ever got up and said, you can be against the war, but don't take this out on the soldiers. Nobody was saying anything about honoring and recognizing the contribution of tens of thousands of men and women who went to Vietnam. And I felt this sense of, my work wasn't done. There was something brewing inside of me that my work wasn't done. And then I had this intense guilt. I was ridden with guilt that I was silent. So I was complicit in this. I wasn't standing up for them either. I wasn't defending them. I was just hiding and hanging on by my fingernails to go to work every morning and survive. And then when I found out there would be a Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., and that it would have the names on this wall, and when I saw this depicted in the newspaper, I remember just saying to Mike, I said, "I'm going." But I said, "I'm going alone. I don't want you with me. This is how I had cut him off from my experience. I said, I went to Vietnam alone, I came home to Vietnam alone, and I have to do this alone. And I didn't know till later that my husband was very hurt by that. But, you know, I had kept him cut out of this for many years. And so I had no idea what would happen when I got there, but I had to find the name, because it was going to have the names. There were two names. First I went to Sharon Lane, because Sharon was killed in June when I was in Vietnam, and I didn't know her. But I remember when the medic came to me, I remember what I was doing. I was hanging an IV on a patient, and this medic came up to me and tapped me on the shoulder and said, Lieutenant, took me aside and he said, an Army nurse was killed in July last night. And I remember how I felt at that moment. I felt something. I felt this, all I could think about was her mother. Just like all the boys, the men I took care of in Vietnam, and it was like, all I could think about was their mothers and their families. And that we knew first before they did. Every nurse in Vietnam knew that Sharon had been killed before her own parents knew. And so I found Sharon's name, and nothing happened. I just touched her hand. And I was very cold. You know, I never cried after Vietnam. I went to my brother's funeral. He was 38 years old. I think he died of cancer, and he had 6 little kids. I think I was the only person at the funeral who didn't cry. And I thought about that after. I thought, there must be something wrong with me. I don't cry. I don't ever cry. I cry over nothing. And my husband said to me once, he said, you're the strangest woman. You don't cry over anything. You never saw me cry. But I couldn't. And then I went to find Eddie Lee Evanson's name, and he was my patient at Bungtown. And Eddie was just this wonderful young kid from Minnesota, and that's how I remembered his name. And when I found Eddie's name, it was on the 68 and 69 plates, and there's these granite plates, and they're marked by year, and then the patients are in, the patients, I'm still thinking my patients. The men who died and women whose names are on the wall are listed, not in alphabetical order, but if they died together, when they died. So there'd be whole units of men who came in as mass casualties, and they're listed together on the wall. And I really liked that. I thought, the planners of this memorial really get it. And then I realized that the biggest plates in this whole Vietnam memorial were 68, 69. The year that I was there, that's when the most were wounded. And when I found Eddie's name, I touched his name, and I still to this day I remember him. He's still 19. And I burst into tears, and I could not stop crying. I just broke down and cried, and I fell on the ground, and I sobbed and I sobbed and I sobbed. So I realized what Eddie did for me. Eddie helped me cry for the first time for him, and then I cried for all of them. And, you know, later when I look back on that, I thought, you know, in Vietnam, we never had time to grieve. There was no grief process. I didn't grieve until 1982. And then I just fell apart. And I came back home, and my mom had come to take care of the kids, and Mom stayed for 2 weeks, and I could hardly get out of bed. And then I cried for my brother, and then it was like I was crying for everybody just everybody. But then the worst was yet to come. Then I started seeing faces, and then I would see the boy in the bed who had been sucking out his trach, and because we were working with generators, the generators would go out, and we had no electricity. Well, you're so busy, and there's not enough staff. If the electricity on the generator goes out, that patient's going to die because he's on life support. He's on a ventilator. Well, if the ventilator isn't working, he's going to die. And you grab an ambu bag and you bag them manually, and the patient will live. Well, that patient didn't live because nobody knew the generator had gone out, and it was at night, so it was dark, and with lights out at night. We worked by flashlights at night. Imagine that. So we didn't know the electricity had gone out because the lights were off anyway. So we're going around by flashlight doing our work, and I get to him, and you know, they think, oh, nurses, why would they have any guilt in Vietnam? Nurses are saving lives. Nurses have a lot of guilt, you know, and I felt guilt about that patient. And I didn't know his name, so I couldn't find it on the wall. But one by one, they would start to haunt me, and then the nightmares. And so there was the aftermath. There was the part of just shutting down, and then there was the part of everything coming back, and the box opening. And now I'm starting to think about the women I'd served with, and how now they're going to add a statue to honor the men at the wall because of the controversy. The wall was very controversial. The shape, that it's underground, the color. People thought it was cold and heartless. It was black, the color of shame. It was buried beneath the ground. It was all this terrible, just like the divisiveness of the war, the memorial, and the woman was a gook, Maya Lin. How could they, you know, hire an architect who looks like the enemy? I mean, terrible things were said. So Secretary Watts of the Interior wouldn't grant them a building permit to build the wall until they served the other faction of Vietnam veterans who wanted something more noble and heroic and portrayed Vietnam veterans. So they portrayed Vietnam veterans as men. And that's when something inside of me was, well, if they put the statue there of men, and that's fine with me, then people will only think about the men. And I think that's when I started to think about the betrayal, the lies. Now they're gonna forget, you know, they're gonna omit the role that women played and only portray the role that men played, and that if it wasn't for the nurses and the women in Vietnam, the wall would be much bigger, and that women needed to heal too. And so it was in Minnesota. I was at, Minnesota had a parade the first time ever for Vietnam veterans. It was in 1983. And that's where the idea started, that I was going to do something now and use my voice to defend the people that I had worked with and defend the men I had served with. So you can see things were just starting to, it was either that, I had to take all that anger. Well, I learned later that anger turned inward as depression. I was depressed and didn't know it. My husband probably knew it, but I was a very functioning person. I loved my kids. I loved my husband. I showed that. But there was there was unfinished business. And then I got sick and was hospitalized. I developed encephalitis, and several young people had died of encephalitis where we lived because there was an endemic of it. It was equine, and Mike picked me up and carried me to the emergency room, and I was in isolation for a week. I almost died. And while I was laying there suffering, because my head hurt so bad, I thought about this was perfect timing. I just wanted to die. It was so nice to be in a hospital and being medicated, and I was so out of it. I wasn't having bad dreams, and I was like, I just wanted to die. And I thought, well, I'm supposed to die now. That's what this is about. And then I started to think about my kids and how they would be left alone. And then Polly, the nurse, when I came to, Polly sat with me and she said to me, she said, were you in Vietnam? And I looked at her like, why? Did I say something? Like, you know, you're out of it, and it's like, what did I say? And she said, well, my husband's a Vietnam vet, and you said some things when you were, you know, not lucid. Were you there? And I said, I was, and what did I say? And she just said a few things, and then she said, she talked about her husband being a Vietnam vet, and she said, you have to get well so you can go home. And after that, I thought, I've been given a second chance. Now I have to do something with it. And so I turned that anger and did something constructive. And that's what kept me going all those 10 years, because it was, and that's another hour and a half, which we don't have. But it took 10 years to get through the process of founding this, taking this vision and turning it into something tangible when all the odds were against it. But I was driven. And I got my adrenaline back.
Did you find much resistance among the Vietnam Veterans Organizations or the federal government?
Oh, it was everywhere.
Just as strong as ever.
And it was insidious in some areas, and it was in your face in other areas. I learned the word misogyny. Men who still hate women, and some men who will do everything in their power to keep women suppressed. But we overcame those, because again, the majority of men, when they found out that there was resistance and opposition to this memorial, and most of them were combat veterans from Vietnam, we had nurses take care of them, they rose up in arms and wrote letters to the editor and sent money and said, if it wasn't for you, we wouldn't be alive. And so the minority of men who were absolutely against this and took steps to basically break the nonprofit by all kinds of efforts. Actually, it worked in our favor, because when newspaper articles came out about why they were opposing this memorial, then the male veterans out there would read that and just write back and just be furious. How dare you say this about these women? I'll give you an example. As soon as we've gone through several steps now with the federal agencies, the Commission of Fine Arts, the National Capital Memorial Commission, the National Capital Planning Commission, and the Secretary of Interior. They are all the gatekeepers to anything that's going to be placed in Washington, D.C., and in particular on the Mall, because the Mall is the most prestigious ground in America. So it's good that they have these policies and all these gates to go through, but they weren't going to let us through that gate. And so they rejected our design, they rejected the idea. And J. Carter Brown, who chaired the Fine Arts Commission, said, well, there's all these people who want to add something to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. If the women get their memorial, the Canine Corps will want theirs. Because the Canine Corps had proposed a memorial of dogs to be placed at the memorial. So it was insensitive comments like that that would hit the newspaper. And then Morley Safer on 60 Minutes, I got a call just a few days after I testified at that hearing, and his Marty Galloway, who worked for him, said, Mr. Safer wants to know if it's true what Mr. Brown said about women in Vietnam and the Canine Corps, and his rationale for opposing this. And I said, it's public record, it's minutes, you can get it from the Secretary of the Commission of Fine Arts. Well, a few days later, I got a call, and Morley Safer said, I want to put 5 nurses on 60 Minutes. And I want these nurses to talk about their experience in Vietnam. And I'm going to tell all the listeners about Mr. Brown and what he said as to why he opposes this memorial. That was a huge turning point for us, because there were 75 million viewers. It was 1989. And we're all so nervous. I mean, first of all, to go on 60 Minutes. Second of all, he's going to ask us questions of things that we have never talked about before. We're all terrified. And it's a very frightening thing to go to New York City and be in 6, and there's the huge clock when you walk in. But Mr. Safer was he's a chain smoker. So he has his big ashtray sitting there, he's puffing on his cigarette. Then he comes back and he's very calm, and very professional, but he disarmed us completely. He was so sincere. So he gained our trust immediately because he was on our side. And I think the woman that touched everybody's heart that night was, I talked about the memorial, and while I was so proud of the women I had served with, and how I felt that their contributions needed to be recognized, and how I felt the families needed to know that we were there when their sons died. I said, because a lot of families don't know that there was a nurse with their son or their husband or their brother, that he didn't die alone. And I thought that would be important to the family to know. And they didn't know that. And so I talked about that, and that we were rejected to have a place at the Vietnam Memorial. But then Maggie Areola responded to a question the same that you asked me a question. And he asked her that question. And he said, how did you get through it day in, day out, day in and day out? How did you do it? Well, she had film footage from Vietnam. Very few of us had video of us in Vietnam, but one of the medics had taken footage of her. She's in the emergency room. She has pigtails, and she's chewing gum. She looks like she's about 15. Pigtails, chewing gum, and she's hanging an IV. This casualty has just come in. She's completely focused on that patient, doing her job and doing her work. And it was just this amazing film footage that nobody in the United States had ever seen before, because they didn't show film footage of nurses in Vietnam. They showed them now. So now there's this imagery. There's a nurse in Vietnam. She's caring for a patient. But Mr. Safer asked her this question, and he said, did you cry? And she said, only once. This patient came in with battlefield amputations. Both arms, both legs were off. One eye was hanging out and dangling on his face. He had blast injuries to his torso. And he was still talking to us because he wasn't in shock yet, because the medics had done the cut downs. The dust-off pilot had brought him in instantly. And this young man was Jewish. And he said, I want a rabbi. And she realized they didn't have a rabbi, but they had a doctor who was Jewish. So she asked the medic, please go get this doctor. And in the meantime, this young man says, I know I don't have any arms, and I don't have any legs, but please tell my mother that I love her. And she said, I could not stop crying. She said, I didn't stop working, but I couldn't stop crying. And there she is, that we're watching her working on a different patient. And then Mr. Safer said, did he live? And she said, we don't know, because then they go to the OR, and we're so busy. And we really don't want to know, because we just, we send them off. And she said she felt guilty for all these years because she didn't contact the mother. She didn't want to answer the questions the mother might ask her about her son. And so she carried that guilt all those years. Well, the next day, or even that night, the phone is ringing at 60 Minutes, and there's this man in the Bronx who's Jewish, and he lost both of his arms and both of his legs, and he lost his eye, and he's blind in the other eye, and he's listening to 60 Minutes, and Maggie Areola, he's screaming at his wife in the kitchen, and he tells his wife, she's talking about me. That's me. How many Jewish boys wanted their mother in Vietnam who lost their eyes and all their limbs? And he lived, and he's listening to 60 Minutes. This is just like the most incredible story of the whole history of the project. And so he's calling 60 Minutes to say, I'm alive, I'm alive. She must be talking about me. Well, it was him. It was him. And I mean, now this is a huge story. And so they put him on 60 Minutes with Maggie, and where he's thanking her for saving his life. And he said, I'll never forget this, he said, you go to the grocery store and you thank the bagger for bagging the groceries, but you never get a chance to thank the person who saved your life. And he was married before he went to Vietnam, and his wife, they were still married. She stayed with him, and he has a good life. He's glad that he survived. And it was just this most touching story, because the other thing among many of us nurses was save them, but save them for what? They'll hate us. They'll hate us for saving them. you should just let them go. I mean, you couldn't. And he's one in triage. He would have been set aside. But the day they brought him in, Maggie said he was the only casualty, or they were very minor. But if they had set him aside, he would never have lived. But he was grateful to be alive, and that makes you feel validated that, you know, we did the right thing. But the thing that was life-changing for me in the history of this memorial is that after all these millions of viewers, I mean, this was just so poignant. And then at the end, Mr. Morley Safer says, and Mr. Brown says these women don't deserve a memorial. It was priceless. So J. Carter Brown wrote him a letter that was read at the end of the month that he tried to backtrack, but he couldn't backtrack. He said what he did, but it was really priceless. And after that, we started getting telegrams. In those days, we still got telegrams. We had to put more phones in our little office to take all the phone calls, and we raised $2 million that year for people who sent money, who said this memorial needs to be built. And most of the letters said, oh my God, there were women in Vietnam. They didn't know we were there. So we were now educating the public who we were and sharing the stories. And you know, if it hadn't been for starting this memorial, that story may never have been shared with the public. I mean, it was always about sharing the stories of what women did in Vietnam, and the backstories, and the backstories to the backstories about their service, but also how women were suffering after the war too, that they needed a healing place, and we needed a healing place too.
Well, we're so lucky that I'm grateful that you persevered with that project. Did the man from the Bronx, did he come to the dedication?
Yes,
or
yes, he did. Yes, he did. And he was so grateful. I mean, can you imagine watching 60 Minutes and hearing your nurse talk about you? It was just, and this is where my faith, I'm a very, very spiritual person, and that's from growing up on a farm. And I'm very connected to the ground. I'm very connected to the earth. My family still farms that farm. It's 5 generations from the Swedes home. My great-grandfather homesteaded it in 1863, and my brother still farms it. And I've always found my solace in the woods or fields or on my horse. I don't have to go into a church to find God. God is here with us right now. I'm in church. This is church. Because where you find God, that's where church is. To me, this is like a church because we're connecting, we're listening to each other. God has brought us together. Because after Vietnam, I was so angry at God for what he or she allowed to happen that I couldn't walk into a church. I did once, and it just made me angry, so I walked out because the pastor was saying, if we truly believe in God, we will have no fears. And I'm thinking, yeah, you don't know what fear is. If you were in Vietnam, you might be in a bunker right now because you're afraid that rocket is going to, and no amount of praying is going to change your fear. So you see where I was coming from. But I would go for a hike, and then I would feel good. And I'll share one more example that was very touching to me, and that's the Lutheran magazine. When they found out what I was doing, it was in the mid-'80s. It was after 60 Minutes. So the Lutheran magazine, the people who are with the magazine were watching 60 Minutes, so they tracked me down. And I might have mentioned that I was a Lutheran on 60 Minutes. And she said to me, I want to thank you for what you're doing, first of all, for those who served in Vietnam. We'd like to do a story for the Lutheran magazine, and we'd like to interview you. Could we set up a time? My first reaction was, I got real serious, and I said, I don't think you want to interview me. And she said, well, can we talk about why? And I said, because I don't believe in God, and you don't want me to say that in the Lutheran magazine, because I'm very angry at God. God didn't come through. And she said to me, and this was God working. She said to me, "Did you ever stop to think that God was there and he was working through the nurses?" And that struck me, like God was there. And God was working through us. And that's how God works. God works through people. And he put us in Vietnam for a reason. We were there to ease the suffering and pain. And that's what God does, to ease the suffering and pain. So then when I was having all this trouble getting this built, I said this prayer in the middle of the night. I woke up and I was grinding my teeth. I was losing weight, and I was losing my hair. I was so stressed out, and I said, "Okay, God, it's your turn now. God, I'm doing all I can here. You have to help me out. It's your turn. You got to do something here." And everything fell into place, and we have a memorial. And when we had one of our hearings, and the AP was there, and Sam Donaldson, do you remember Sam Donaldson? Was he NBC or ABC? Sam Donaldson was there. He comes down the steps and he's got a microphone in his hand, and he said, "Well, what's it going to take to get this memorial built, Miss Evans?" And I said, "It's going to take an act of God and Congress." And we went to Congress, we got the bills passed, and, I wasn't in this alone. There was I couldn't have done it alone. And all the people who came to help me, that was also his work. All those wonderful people. I didn't do this alone. I kept the vision and I was out in the forefront, but this was the work of a lot of good people.
That sentiment about God being at work takes us back to the beginning of the interview. It seems like that was your original reason for going into the military, serve as a nurse, go to Vietnam. Irrespective of the reasons why we were there, the whole domino effect of the Cold War and so forth, but just to serve other human beings. So you do God's work, it sounds like. You didn't know it.
I didn't know. And I didn't think about it in that way at all. But he was right there with me, walking by my side.
We have just a couple of minutes, and what I'd like to ask you to do to wrap this up is, as you're talking to university students today, 10 years, 20 years down the road, who will be watching this, any message that you have for them that comes out of your life or out of your experience?
I do, and I think it's the result of my Vietnam experience, and it's the result of a lot of factors. And this is going to be very political, but we need to question our government. Question the president. Question the administration. Don't just blindly believe them. We blindly believed President Bush about war in Iraq. We should have been questioning, we should have been protesting a whole lot more, and we could be doing it today. But war is not always the answer. I wish I could say I was a pacifist, but I think about Hitler. And I think about the kind of people like Hitler, and Studs Terkel called World War II the good war. And we know what he means by that, but it was a war maybe that had to be fought. But other wars, power of a leader, it comes from someone who can avoid war. It takes a lot more energy and a lot more intelligence and leadership to have peace than to have war. And war is not the answer, and we have to stop the killing. We have to stop killing people for answers. And one war leads to another, as we see, because it's the ripple effect. So now we're in Iraq, now we're in Afghanistan, now we'll be in Iran. It just is ongoing. So question leadership, be active politically, or be a protester, but make those protests peaceful. Civil protests, peaceful protests, speak up. That's what patriotism is. Patriotism is not supporting the president. And what the president says, patriotism is supporting what is good for your country. And you have to come to terms with what's good for our country. And maybe spending trillions of dollars on a war overseas isn't good for our country because we're going to bankrupt our country when we could be spending that money on making our own country strong. So it's keeping our country strong. The second is, of course, if you support the war or don't support the war, either or, that's your choice. We are Americans. But always support the soldiers who go and support them when they come home. Because we are responsible for them when they come home. Support them in every way possible.
So speak the truth, but do it peacefully, do it respectfully.
Yes. And question. You know, we were
Be a
labeled.
good lesson for politics in general these days.
And history, learn history. I always said, and this will be a political statement on my part, if our President Bush had known history, and the whole Ottoman Empire when it was split up, and how that is just how the ripple effect, and it started even before that, but the ripple effect of breaking up all those countries, and the tribes, and how you can't go in and deal with tribes when, how are we gonna make a democracy where there's tribal? And perhaps if he and his administrators had understood history, maybe we wouldn't be where we are today. So historians need to get involved big time and preach and teach to our administrators about history, because it's like Vietnam, the history of Vietnam. I mean, we were funding the French. I'm sure the historians here who have studied Indochina and the French involvement know that the United States was giving France the money to fight the war in South Vietnam. We were there, after World War II. That war really started in 1945. But the French failed, so we walk in and think we can make a difference. And instead, we killed 3 million people. Think about it. Agent Orange was chemical warfare. I'll wrap this up. When I think back on my biological warfare teacher at Fort Sam Houston, and then I piece this all together now that we committed chemical warfare in Vietnam. We dropped dioxin. The country was decimated. The agriculture was decimated. Thousands of babies were born with defects. Think about what the United States did to that country, in addition to our own people. And they would never be culpable for that, admit it. It took a class action Agent Orange lawsuit. I was on that board. I fought against Dow Chemical with the class action lawsuit. I was on Judge Weinstein's board for the veterans to get some compensation for their death and dying and for the families. I mean, it was one travesty after another. And so, I guess to wrap this up, it's fight for what you believe in, because what have you got to lose? I decided when I was so nervous to testify before Congress. To testify before Congress when you're a nurse, it's like, hey, I was taught nursing, but I would pray for grace. And I say, okay, God, just give me the grace to get through this. And then my knees would stop shaking. And as soon as I started to talk, but I would never cry, and I would never be angry, and that's grace. And I'm thankful for that, because if you get angry or you cry, then you lose it. The audience says, oh, she's just a wimpy woman. Or if you're angry, you lose people. So I was able to talk before Congress and get my message across, but I would also say, okay, if I could do what I did in Vietnam, I can talk to these senators. That's a piece of cake. Nobody's going to die if I make a mistake. So it was a lot of self-talk, but just have the courage, I guess, to speak out, because there are plenty of other people who may need you to speak out for them.
We're so grateful that you did. Diane Evans,
Thank
you
you
very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.